Millionaire CEO tries to fire the janitor, but a child answers, "Daddy, don't fire Mommy." Upon hearing this, his life changes completely. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The mahogany desk gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the 42nd floor as Richard Sterling adjusted his Italian silk tie and reached for his phone. At 45, he commanded respect in every boardroom from Manhattan to Los Angeles. His steel-gray eyes had seen empires built and fortunes lost, but they had never seen compassion as a profitable venture. "Sarah, get me the new cleaning lady on the line immediately," he barked into his intercom, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I don't care if she's in the middle of mopping the floors. I want her fired, and I want it done now." Richard Sterling didn't believe in second chances. In his world, weakness was a disease that spread faster than gossip in a small town. The new janitor, what was her name again? Maria something, had made the unforgivable mistake of leaving water spots on his conference room table yesterday. Important clients were coming today, and perfection wasn't negotiable in his empire. His fingers drummed impatiently against the mahogany surface as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like money slipping through his fingers, time wasted on insignificant people who couldn't even clean a table properly. "Hello?" The voice that answered wasn't what he expected. It was small, innocent, and unmistakably that of a child. "What the hell?" Richard caught himself, his business instincts kicking in even through his confusion. "Who is this? I asked to speak with the cleaning woman." "This is Emma," the little voice replied, clear as a bell despite the slight tremor he could detect. "Are you the mean man Mommy cries about?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. No one had called him mean since he was a child himself. His jaw tightened as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Listen, little girl, I need to speak with your mother immediately. This is her employer, and please, Mr. Sterling." The child's voice cracked with an emotion that made something uncomfortable twist in Richard's chest. "Please don't fire my mommy. She works so hard, and she loves you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Richard's hand froze on the phone, his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "What did you just say?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Mommy says she loves you," Emma continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of desperation. "She cries sometimes and looks at your picture in the newspaper. She says you used to be different, that you used to laugh and make her feel safe. Please, Daddy, don't take her job away." The phone slipped from Richard's numb fingers, clattering against the desk like his entire world collapsing around him. The word Daddy echoed in his mind, each repetition like a hammer blow to his chest. Daddy. How could this child know to call him that? Who was Maria really, and why did this little girl's voice sound so familiar, like an echo from a dream he'd forgotten years ago? Richard's hands shook as he picked up the phone again, but the line had gone dead. Outside his window, the city buzzed with life, but inside his corner office, time had stopped completely. 7 years ago. There had been someone special. Someone he'd walked away from when building his empire became more important than building a life. Someone whose last name might have been Rodriguez. Maria Rodriguez. The realization hit him like lightning splitting an ancient oak tree. His perfect, controlled world suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass, and for the first time in decades, Richard Sterling didn't know what to do next. Richard's hands trembled as he stared at the silent phone, the child's words echoing through his mind like a haunting melody. "Daddy, don't take her job away." 7 years? 7 long years since he made the biggest mistake of his life, choosing ambition over love, power over the woman who had shown him what it meant to be truly alive, Maria Rodriguez. Even thinking her name sent waves of regret crashing through his carefully constructed defenses. She had been his secretary back when Sterling Industries was just a small consulting firm operating out of a cramped downtown office. While he worked 18-hour days building his dream, she had been his anchor, bringing him coffee at midnight, reminding him to eat, laughing at his terrible jokes when exhaustion made him giddy. But Maria had been more than just an employee. She had been his light in a world that was rapidly becoming consumed by darkness. Her smile could melt away the stress of failed deals and demanding clients. Her gentle touch on his shoulder as she placed contracts on his desk had been the highlight of his days. And those stolen moments, conversations that stretched late into the evening, shared dinners in the empty office, the night she had fallen asleep on his couch after helping him prepare for the biggest presentation of his career, those moments had been the closest he'd ever come to true happiness. The night everything changed flashed through his memory with painful clarity. The Henderson Group had offered to buy his company for $15 million, but only if he relocated to Chicago immediately and dedicated himself completely to the expansion. No distractions. No personal attachments. Just pure, unadulterated focus on building an empire. "I love you, Richard," Maria had whispered that last night, tears streaming down her beautiful face as he packed his belongings. "We can make this work. I can come with you, or we can try long distance. Please don't throw away what we have for money that won't love you back." But he had been so certain that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Success demanded sacrifice, and he had been willing to sacrifice everything, including the only woman who had ever seen past his ambitions to the man underneath. "I'm sorry, Maria," he had said, his voice cold and businesslike even as his heart shattered. "This is bigger than us. You'll understand someday." The last thing he remembered was her broken sob as she walked out of his life forever. Now, sitting in his glass tower 42 floors above the streets where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, Richard realized he had been the biggest fool in New York City. All his wealth, all his power, all his success, none of it had filled the void that Maria had left behind. He had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone, that independence was strength. But hearing that little girl's voice, knowing that Maria might have been raising their child alone all these years, made him feel smaller than he ever had. He reached for his laptop with shaking fingers and pulled up the employee files. There she was, Maria Elena Rodriguez, hired 3 weeks ago as part of the night cleaning crew. The photograph was small and grainy, but those eyes, those warm, compassionate brown eyes that had haunted his dreams for 7 years, were unmistakable. His phone buzzed with an incoming text from his assistant Sarah. "The cleaning crew starts at 6 p.m. Should I still arrange for Ms. Rodriguez to be terminated?" Richard stared at the message for a long moment, his finger hovering over the keyboard. Everything in his corporate world told him to proceed as planned. Weakness was cancer in the business world. Personal feelings had no place in professional decisions. But that little voice kept echoing in his mind. "Please, Daddy, don't take her job away." What if Emma really was his daughter? What if Maria had discovered she was pregnant after he left, and had been too proud to tell him? What if he had a 7-year-old little girl who needed her mother's job to survive? The possibility made his chest feel like it was caught in a vice. Richard Sterling, who had never backed down from a hostile takeover or a $1 million negotiation, suddenly felt terrified of a conversation with a woman he once loved and a child who might be his own flesh and blood. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window, a successful man in an expensive suit, surrounded by the symbols of his achievements, but utterly alone. For the first time in 7 years, Richard wondered if he had won the game but lost everything that mattered. The clock on his desk read 5:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, Maria would walk through the doors of Sterling Industries, probably never suspecting that the man who had abandoned her was now her boss. Richard loosened his tie and made a decision that would either heal his broken heart or destroy what little peace he had managed to build in his loveless life. The elevator descended slowly, each floor marking another step toward a confrontation that Richard had spent 7 years avoiding. He had dismissed his remaining staff early, claiming a family emergency. The irony wasn't lost on him. The entire 42nd floor was empty now, save for the ghosts of his past and the crushing weight of his regret. At exactly 6 p.m., the elevator chimed softly, and Richard's heart nearly stopped. Through the frosted glass doors of the main entrance, he could see figures moving in the hallway. The cleaning crew had arrived. Maria would be among them. Richard positioned himself behind his office door, watching through the narrow gap as the team spread out across the floor. His hands were sweating, something that hadn't happened since his first board meeting 15 years ago. Richard Sterling, the man who had stared down Fortune 500 CEOs and international investors, was terrified of facing a woman who used to bring him soup when he was sick. Then he saw her. Maria moved with the same graceful efficiency that had made her the best assistant he'd ever had. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard gray uniform of the cleaning service, but to Richard, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. The years had added subtle lines around her eyes and a touch of weariness to her posture, but her movements still held that gentle confidence that had first captured his attention. She was directing the other workers with quiet authority, pointing toward different sections of the office space. Even in a job that most people would consider beneath them, Maria brought dignity and professionalism to her work. Richard felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him. While he had been building his empire in climate-controlled boardrooms, Maria had been working multiple jobs to support herself and possibly their daughter. As if sensing his presence, Maria suddenly looked up toward his office. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass partition, and the world seemed to stop. Recognition flickered across her face like lightning, followed immediately by shock, then something that looked like fear. Richard stepped out from behind the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Maria stood frozen in the middle of the office space, a cleaning cart beside her, staring at him as if he were a ghost materialized from her worst nightmares. "Hello, Maria," he said softly, his voice carrying across the empty office. The other cleaning workers continued their tasks, oblivious to the drama unfolding between their supervisor and the man who owned the building. Maria's hands gripped the handle of her cart so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice professionally neutral despite the tremor he could detect underneath. "I didn't realize you worked such late hours." The formality in her tone cut deeper than any accusation could have. They had once shared inside jokes and secret smiles. She used to call him Richard, or sometimes Richie when she was feeling playful. Now he was Mr. Sterling, just another boss in an expensive suit. "I needed to speak with you," Richard said, taking a step closer. "It's important." Maria glanced around at her coworkers, clearly uncomfortable with the attention their conversation might draw. "If this is about my work performance, sir, I can assure you that it's not about your work," Richard interrupted gently. "It's about Emma." The color drained from Maria's face so quickly that Richard instinctively moved forward, afraid she might faint. Her grip on the cleaning cart was the only thing keeping her upright. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but her eyes told a different story. "I received a phone call today," Richard continued, his voice soft but insistent. "A little girl answered your phone and asked me not to fire her mommy. She called me Daddy, Maria." The silence that followed was deafening. Around them, the sound of vacuum cleaners and the routine bustle of the cleaning crew created a surreal backdrop to the most important conversation of Richard's life. Maria's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she turned away from him, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "You left," she said, her voice breaking. "You chose your career over everything else. You made it clear that I meant nothing to you." "That's not true," Richard said desperately. "You meant everything to me. I was just too stupid and scared to realize it until it was too late." "Well, it is too late," Maria replied, spinning back to face him with fire in her eyes. 7 years too late. Emma doesn't need a father who shows up when it's convenient for him. We've managed just fine without you." But even as she spoke the words, Richard could see the exhaustion etched in every line of her face. The multiple jobs, the struggle to make ends meet, the challenge of raising a child alone, it was all there in her eyes. "Is she mine, Maria?" he asked quietly. "Is Emma my daughter?" Maria's silence was answer enough. In that moment, Richard felt his entire world shift on its axis. He had a daughter. A 7-year-old little girl who loved her mother fiercely, and had somehow known to call him Daddy even though they had never met. "I need to see her," Richard said, his voice raw with emotion. "Please." Maria shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. You gave up that right 7 years ago when you walked away from us. The pain in her voice was like a knife to his heart, but Richard pressed on. I know I don't deserve it. I know I hurt you in ways that can never be forgiven. But Emma is my daughter too, and she deserves to know her father. Does she? Maria challenged. What kind of father abandons a woman carrying his child? What kind of father chooses money over family? Richard had no answer for that. The truth was too ugly, too selfish to defend, but before he could respond, Maria's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, and her expression immediately softened. Hi, baby, she answered, her voice transforming from hurt anger to gentle love. No, Mommy's still at work. Are you being good for Mrs. Patterson? Richard's heart clenched as he realized he was listening to Maria talk to their daughter. His daughter. What? Oh, honey, you don't need to worry about that anymore, Maria continued, shooting a confused glance at Richard. Mommy's job is safe. There was a pause, and then Maria's eyes widened in shock. Emma, how did you know that? How did you get this number? Another pause, longer this time. You called who? Maria's face went through a spectrum of emotions as she listened to Emma's explanation on the phone. Confusion, shock, and something that looked like pride flickered across her features as Richard watched, feeling like an outsider in the most important moment of his life. Emma Rose Rodriguez, you tell me right now how you got Mr. Sterling's phone number, Maria said, trying to sound stern but failing to hide the amazement in her voice. Richard's heart skipped a beat at hearing his daughter's full name for the first time. Emma Rose. It was perfect, just like the little girl he was only now discovering existed. Okay, slow down, Maria continued into the phone. You found what in my old box? And you looked up the company name online? Emma, you're 7 years old. How do you even know how to do internet searches? Richard couldn't help but smile despite the tension of the moment. It seemed his daughter had inherited his determination and resourcefulness, along with Maria's intelligence. The thought filled him with an unexpected surge of pride. No, baby, you're not in trouble, Maria said gently. But we need to talk about this when I get home. I love you too. Be good for Mrs. Patterson, and I'll be home soon. She ended the call and stood there for a moment, staring at her phone as if it held the answers to all of life's mysteries. She found an old business card of mine in a shoebox under my bed, Maria finally explained, her voice barely above a whisper. One from back when you were just starting the company. She said she's been worrying about money because she heard me crying after I got the bills last week. So she decided to call the nice man from Mommy's pictures to ask him to help us. Richard felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. She called me the nice man? Maria nodded, fresh tears threatening to spill over. I kept some photos from before. I probably should have thrown them away, but Emma found them a few months ago. She kept asking about the man in the pictures who made me smile so much. I told her you were someone special from a long time ago. The weight of 7 lost years pressed down on Richard's shoulders. While he had been building his empire, his daughter had been studying his face in old photographs, wondering about the father she had never met. The little girl had somehow sensed the connection between them, even across years of separation and silence. Maria, Richard said softly, I need you to know something. I never knew about Emma. If I had known you were pregnant, would it have mattered? Maria interrupted, her voice sharp with old pain. You made your choice clear. The Henderson deal was more important than anything else. You're right, Richard admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I was selfish and blind and stupid. But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to be the father Emma deserves from this moment forward. Maria studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to see past the expensive suit and polished exterior to the man she had once loved. She asks about you, you know. Not directly, but she'll point to couples holding hands on the street and ask why some kids have daddies and others don't. I never knew what to tell her. The image of his little girl wondering about absent fathers made Richard's chest tight with emotion. What did you say? I told her that sometimes daddies have to go away, but that doesn't mean they don't love their children. I told her that her daddy loved her very much, even if he couldn't be with us. Maria's voice broke slightly. I lied, Richard. I had no idea if you would ever love her because you never even knew she existed. Richard stepped closer, his hand reaching out instinctively to comfort her before he caught himself. It wasn't a lie, Maria. I do love her. I loved her the moment I heard her voice on that phone call. I loved her when I realized she was mine. I've been empty for 7 years, and I never understood why until today. Love isn't enough, Maria said, but her voice lacked conviction. Emma needs stability. She needs someone who won't disappear when things get difficult. I'm not going anywhere, Richard said firmly. I know I have no right to ask for a second chance, but I'm asking anyway. Let me be her father. Let me be the man I should have been 7 years ago. Maria looked around the empty office, seeming to remember where they were and that her coworkers were still cleaning nearby. I can't have this conversation here, she said. Not like this. Then let's have it somewhere else, Richard said quickly. Dinner. Tomorrow night. Just the 3 of us. Let me meet my daughter properly. Richard, I don't think, please, he interrupted. One dinner. If Emma doesn't want to see me again after that, I'll respect her wishes. But she deserves the chance to decide for herself. Maria was quiet for so long that Richard wondered if she was going to refuse. Finally, she spoke in a voice so soft he had to strain to hear her. She's been asking for a daddy for her upcoming school play. All the other kids have fathers who are going to attend, and she's the only one who will be sitting with just her mom. Maria's eyes met his, and Richard saw a vulnerability there that reminded him of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. Maybe one dinner wouldn't hurt. Richard felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly knocked him off his feet. Thank you, Maria. You won't regret this. I already regret this, Maria said, but there was a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Emma is going to be impossible to contain when she finds out. She's been planning this reunion in her head for months, ever since she found those photos. She's been planning a reunion? Richard asked, amazed by his daughter's optimism and determination. She made a list, Maria admitted, her smile growing slightly. Things she wants to ask you, things she wants to show you, places she thinks families should go together. She's very organized for a 7-year-old. The thought of Emma making lists and plans involving him made Richard's heart feel like it might burst. She sounds incredible. She is, Maria said, her voice full of fierce maternal pride. She's smart and kind and funny. She has your stubborn streak and your problem-solving skills, but she has a heart bigger than both of ours combined. Richard realized he was crying, something he hadn't done since his father's funeral 15 years ago. I've missed so much. Yes, you have, Maria said gently. But maybe it's not too late to start making new memories. As the cleaning crew began to wrap up their work around them, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years. Hope for a future that included more than just profit margins and acquisition deals. But as he looked at Maria's cautious expression, he also realized that winning back his family would be the most challenging negotiation of his life. And unlike his business deals, this was one where failure would cost him everything that truly mattered. Richard barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's face, a face he could only imagine, combining Maria's delicate features with his own stubborn jawline. He found himself wondering what she liked to eat, what made her laugh, whether she was afraid of the dark or brave like her mother. By 5 a.m., he gave up on sleep entirely and found himself in his home office, researching everything he could about 7-year-old children. What did second graders like to do? What were appropriate gifts for a first meeting? How did one talk to a child who was both a stranger and his own flesh and blood? Richard Sterling, who could navigate the most complex corporate mergers, felt completely lost when it came to understanding his own daughter. His penthouse apartment, which had always felt like a symbol of his success, now seemed cold and sterile. The modern furniture and expensive art collection that had once impressed clients suddenly looked unwelcoming for a child. There were no family photos, no toys, no signs that anyone who valued human connection had ever lived there. As dawn broke over the Manhattan skyline, Richard made a decision that would have shocked his business associates. He called his assistant Sarah and told her to cancel all his meetings for the day. For the first time in his professional career, Richard Sterling was putting family before business. His first stop was a bookstore in Soho that specialized in children's literature. The elderly woman behind the counter smiled knowingly when he explained that he was shopping for his 7-year-old daughter. "First time meeting her?" she asked gently, and Richard wondered if his nervousness was that obvious. "Something like that," he admitted. She guided him through sections of age-appropriate books, explaining which stories captured children's imagination and which taught valuable lessons. Richard found himself drawn to a beautifully illustrated book about a father and daughter who built a treehouse together. The clerk noticed his choice and nodded approvingly. "Building something together is a wonderful metaphor for rebuilding a relationship," she said wisely. Richard's next stop was a toy store that looked like something out of a fairy tale. He wandered the aisles feeling overwhelmed by the sheer variety of options. Did Emma like dolls? Art supplies? Science kits? Board games? Everything seemed either too young or too advanced, too presumptuous or too impersonal. Finally, a young father shopping with his own daughter noticed Richard's confusion. "Let me guess," the man said with a smile. "Shopping for someone special but not sure what she likes yet?" "My daughter," Richard admitted. "I'm just getting to know her." "Best advice I ever got," the father said, pointing to a selection of art supplies, "is to choose something you can do together. It's not about the toy itself, it's about the time you spend playing with it." Richard ended up selecting a beginner's art set with watercolors, colored pencils, and a small easel. If Emma liked to draw, they could create art together. If she didn't, well, at least he would have tried. His final stop before dinner was the most important one, a jewelry store in the Diamond District. Richard had been thinking about this all day, remembering how Maria used to admire a delicate gold locket in the window of a shop near their old office. He had always meant to buy it for her but had convinced himself that business came first. The jeweler showed him several options, but Richard was drawn to a simple gold locket in the shape of a heart. It was elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of piece a young girl could treasure for years. He had it engraved with Emma Rose on the front and "Love, Dad" on the back, then carefully placed a tiny photo of himself inside, one that Maria had taken during their happier days, when his smile had been genuine and full of hope. As he drove to the restaurant that evening, Richard's hands shook on the steering wheel. He had chosen a family-friendly Italian place in Maria's neighborhood, somewhere Emma would feel comfortable and that wouldn't intimidate her with its formality. But now he wondered if he should have picked somewhere nicer, or more casual, or completely different altogether. What if Emma didn't like him? What if she had built up an image of her father in her mind that he could never live up to? What if 7 years of absence had created a gap that one dinner could never bridge? Richard pulled into the parking lot 15 minutes early and sat in his car, watching families enter the restaurant together. He saw fathers lifting their children, mothers wiping sauce from small faces, kids laughing and chattering excitedly about their day. These people made parenting look natural and effortless, while Richard felt like he was about to perform surgery without any training. At exactly 6:30, he saw them approaching from across the street. Maria was holding the hand of a little girl with long dark hair and a bright red coat. Even from a distance, Richard could see that Emma was skipping slightly as she walked, her excitement evident in every bouncing step. His daughter. Richard's breath caught in his throat as they got closer. Emma was beautiful. She had Maria's warm brown eyes and delicate features, but her chin had the determined set that Richard recognized from his own reflection. She was carrying a small backpack covered in cartoon characters, and she kept looking up at Maria with an expression of barely contained anticipation. When they reached the restaurant entrance, Emma spotted Richard immediately. Instead of the shyness he had expected, she waved enthusiastically, as if greeting an old friend she hadn't seen in a while. "Mommy, is that him?" he heard her ask in a stage whisper that carried across the parking lot. Is that my daddy? Maria nodded, and Emma's face lit up with a smile so radiant that Richard felt his heart physically ache. She tugged on Maria's hand, clearly eager to close the distance between them. Richard got out of his car on unsteady legs and walked toward them, carrying the art set and the small gift bag containing the locket. As they met in front of the restaurant, Emma looked up at him with curious, intelligent eyes that held no trace of fear or resentment. Hi, she said simply, her voice the same sweet tone he remembered from their phone conversation. I'm Emma Rose Rodriguez. Are you really my daddy? Richard knelt down so they were at eye level, his throat tight with emotion. Yes, sweetheart. I'm really your daddy. And I'm very, very happy to meet you. Emma studied his face for a moment, as if comparing it to the photos she had memorized. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around his neck in a hug that nearly brought him to tears. I knew you would come, she whispered against his ear. Mommy said you might be too busy, but I knew you would come. Over Emma's shoulder, Richard met Maria's eyes and saw that she was crying too. In that moment, holding his daughter for the first time, Richard realized that all the money and success in the world meant nothing compared to this simple, perfect moment. But he also realized that this was just the beginning. Earning Emma's love would be easy. She was a child with a generous heart who wanted nothing more than to have a father. Earning Maria's forgiveness and trust would be the real challenge. As they walked into the restaurant together, Richard couldn't help but notice how Maria kept a careful distance between them, even as Emma chattered excitedly about everything she wanted to show him. The little girl might be ready to welcome him with open arms, but her mother's heart was still heavily guarded. Richard had spent years learning how to read people's motivations and desires in business settings, but as he watched Maria's carefully neutral expression, he realized he had no idea how to navigate the complex emotions of the woman he had hurt so deeply 7 years ago. Dinner started better than Richard had dared to hope. Emma was a natural conversationalist, peppering him with questions about his work, his car, and whether he had ever met any celebrities. She showed him drawings from her backpack, pictures of stick-figure families and elaborate houses with flowers that were taller than the trees. This one is us, Emma said proudly, pointing to a drawing of 3 figures holding hands in front of a house with a crooked chimney. I drew it before I even met you. I just knew what our family would look like. Richard's throat tightened as he studied the picture. The father figure was wearing a suit and had Emma's version of his hair, while the mother looked exactly like Maria. They were all smiling in the way that only a child's artwork could capture, pure, uncomplicated happiness. It's perfect, Richard said honestly. Can I keep it? Emma's face lit up. Really? You want to keep my drawing? I want to frame it and put it in my office, Richard said, and he meant it. That way I can look at it every day and remember this dinner. Maria had been quiet through most of the meal, watching the interaction between father and daughter with a mixture of wonder and wariness. Richard could see her struggling between her desire to protect Emma and her amazement at how naturally they were connecting. As Emma excused herself to wash her hands before dessert, Maria finally spoke directly to Richard for the first time that evening. She's been practicing, Maria said softly. All week, she's been rehearsing what she wanted to say to you. She made lists of questions and practiced conversations with her dolls. She's incredible, Richard said. Maria, I can't thank you enough for raising such an amazing little girl. You did it all on your own, and you did it perfectly. I didn't have a choice, Maria replied, but there was no bitterness in her voice. When you love someone, you do whatever it takes to give them the best life possible. I want to be part of that now, Richard said earnestly. I want to help. Not just financially, but really be part of her life. School events, bedtime stories, helping with homework, everything I missed. Maria was about to respond when Emma returned to the table, practically bouncing with excitement. Daddy, I have something really important to tell you, Emma announced as she climbed back into her chair. But it's a secret that Mommy doesn't know I know. Maria's expression immediately shifted to concern. Emma, what kind of secret? Emma looked between her parents with the serious expression that children wear when they believe they're sharing earth-shattering news. "I know why you and Daddy didn't get married," she said matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Patterson told me when she thought I was sleeping." Richard felt his blood turn cold. Mrs. Patterson was Maria's elderly neighbor who watched Emma when Maria worked late shifts. What could she possibly know about their past? "Emma, honey, what did Mrs. Patterson say?" Maria asked gently, but Richard could see the tension in her shoulders. "She said that Daddy had to choose between his business and his family, and he picked the business because Grandpa Robert made him," Emma explained with the clarity that children sometimes possess. "She said Grandpa Robert told Daddy that if he didn't take the Chicago job, he would make sure Daddy never got another good job anywhere." The restaurant seemed to fade away around them. Richard's father, Robert Sterling, had died 5 years ago, taking his secrets with him to the grave. But apparently, he hadn't taken them all. "Mrs. Patterson said Grandpa Robert came to see Mommy after Daddy left," Emma continued, oblivious to the bombshell she was dropping. "He told her that Daddy didn't want us anymore and that she should never try to contact him. But Mrs. Patterson said that was a lie, because she saw Daddy crying in his car outside our old apartment building 3 different times." Richard's world tilted on its axis. His father had visited Maria? His father had told her that Richard didn't want them? And somehow, Mrs. Patterson had witnessed Richard's desperate attempts to see Maria in those first few weeks after he left, attempts he had ultimately abandoned when Maria never appeared at the window or answered his calls. "That's impossible," Maria whispered, her face pale. "Your grandfather never. I never saw Richard after he left." "Mrs. Patterson has pictures," Emma said proudly. "She showed me. She takes pictures of everyone who comes to the building because she's the unofficial neighborhood watch. She said she kept them in case Mommy ever needed proof that Daddy really did love us." Richard felt like he was drowning. His father had systematically destroyed his chance at happiness with Maria, and he had never known. All these years, he had believed that Maria simply hadn't cared enough to fight for their relationship. All these years, Maria had believed that he had willingly abandoned her. "Emma," Richard said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "do you think Mrs. Patterson would be willing to talk to me and your mommy together?" "Oh, yes," Emma said excitedly. "She's been waiting for this day forever. She said grown-ups are sometimes too stubborn to see the truth, but children always know when people belong together." Maria was staring at Richard with an expression he couldn't read. Shock, confusion, and something that might have been hope flickered across her features. "Your father told me you never wanted to see me again," she said slowly. "He said you had instructed him to make sure I understood that our relationship was a mistake you wanted to forget." "I never told him that," Richard said urgently. "Maria, I never even told him about us. He figured it out on his own and decided that you were a threat to my success. I came back to look for you dozens of times, but you had moved, and no one would tell me where you had gone. Because your father told everyone in the building that you were dangerous," Maria said, the pieces finally falling into place. "He said you were unstable and that we needed to be protected from you." The magnitude of his father's deception was staggering. Robert Sterling had manipulated them both, destroying their relationship to ensure that Richard remained focused solely on building the Sterling empire. And he had been so successful that they had spent 7 years believing lies instead of seeking the truth. "There's more," Emma said, clearly enjoying being the bearer of such important information. "Mrs. Patterson said Mommy wrote you letters every week for 2 years, but she never sent them because Grandpa Robert told her you had moved to Europe and didn't want to be found." Richard closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of what they had lost. 2 years of letters that Maria had written but never sent. 2 years of her reaching out across the void his father had created between them. When he opened his eyes, Maria was crying silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. "I need to see those pictures," Richard said. "And the letters if you still have them. Maria, we need to talk to Mrs. Patterson tonight." "Can we go now?" Emma asked eagerly. "She's always awake at night because she watches the building. And she's been dying to tell someone her secret for years." As they left the restaurant together, Richard realized that everything he thought he knew about the past 7 years had been built on lies. His father had stolen their chance at happiness, but somehow, through the innocent honesty of a 7-year-old girl and the careful observation of a neighborhood watch lady, the truth was finally coming to light. The question now was whether 7 years of deception and pain could be overcome by the love that had never really died between them. But as Emma took his hand on one side and Maria's hand on the other, forming the family chain she had drawn in her pictures, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that his greatest success might not be measured in dollars after all. The walk to Mrs. Patterson's apartment felt like stepping into a time machine. Richard recognized every corner of Maria's old neighborhood, the small grocery store, the coffee shop where they'd shared morning conversations, the park where they dreamed about their future together. Each familiar sight was a painful reminder of what his father's lies had stolen from them. Mrs. Patterson answered her door as if she'd been expecting them for years. Her sharp blue eyes immediately fixed on Richard with an intensity that made him feel like he was being examined under a microscope. "So you're the young man who's been breaking hearts for 7 years," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed decades of human drama. "Took you long enough to figure out the truth." Her small apartment was filled with plants, vintage furniture, and what appeared to be a sophisticated surveillance system. Multiple cameras were positioned at different windows, and a large corkboard dominated one wall, covered with photographs, notes, and detailed timelines. Emma immediately gravitated toward a bowl of butterscotch candies. "Show them the wall, Mrs. Patterson," she said excitedly. "Show them all the proof." Mrs. Patterson gestured toward the corkboard with obvious pride. "I've been documenting this neighborhood for 32 years. Not because I'm nosy, but because someone needs to keep track of what really happens. Too many love stories get destroyed by lies and pride." Richard stepped closer to examine the board, his breath catching in his throat. There, prominently displayed, was a section labeled "The Sterling Deception," in neat handwriting. Photographs were arranged chronologically, showing Richard sitting in his car outside the building, his face clearly visible, sometimes talking on his phone with obvious distress. "This was 3 weeks after you left for Chicago," Mrs. Patterson explained, pointing to a dated photo. "You came back 5 different times that month. Always around evening, always looking like a man who'd lost everything that mattered." "I was calling her," Richard said quietly, studying his own anguished expression in the photographs. "I kept trying her number, but it was disconnected." "Because your father had it changed," Mrs. Patterson said grimly. "Oh yes, I know all about Robert Sterling's visit. He made quite an impression on everyone in this building." She moved to another section revealing photos of a distinguished older man with silver hair and Richard's same determined jawline. "Your father came here exactly 4 days after you left. Told Maria a pack of lies about how you never wanted to see her again, how you considered your relationship an embarrassing mistake that was beneath your social status." Maria sank into a floral armchair, her face pale. "He was so convincing," she whispered. "He said Richard had sent him personally to make sure I understood that any attempt to contact you would result in legal consequences. The man was a master manipulator," Mrs. Patterson said with disgust. "But he didn't stop there. He went to every neighbor, every shop owner on this block. Told them all that Richard was dangerous, possibly unstable, and that they should call the police if he ever showed up asking about Maria." Richard felt physically sick. His father had systematically poisoned everyone against him, ensuring that even if he persisted in looking for Maria, no one would have helped him find her. "But here's the part that will really break your heart," Mrs. Patterson continued, moving to a small filing cabinet. She pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Maria. "Show him what you wrote, dear." With trembling hands, Maria opened the folder to reveal dozens of handwritten letters, all addressed to Richard in Chicago. The first ones were love letters, pouring out her heart and begging him to call. But as Richard read over her shoulder, the tone gradually shifted to confusion, then hurt, then desperate pleas for any kind of response. "I wrote you every week for 2 years," Maria said, her voice breaking. I told you about the pregnancy, about Emma's birth, about every milestone you were missing. I poured my soul into those letters, even though your father told me you'd moved to Europe and left no forwarding address. The letter in Richard's hands was dated 3 months after Emma's birth. Maria's handwriting was shaky from exhaustion, but her words were clear. Our daughter has your eyes, Richard. She's beautiful and perfect, and she deserves to know her father. I don't understand why you won't respond, but I haven't given up hope that someday you'll remember what we meant to each other. I never received any of these, Richard said, his voice raw with emotion. Maria, I swear to you, I never knew about Emma. If I had known. Your father made sure you wouldn't, Mrs. Patterson said sadly. He was more thorough than you can imagine. Mrs. Patterson wasn't finished with her revelations. She returned to her filing cabinet and pulled out another folder, this one much thinner but somehow more ominous. What happened to Mommy's letters? Emma asked innocently while unwrapping another candy. Did Grandpa Robert really steal them? The elderly woman's expression grew darker. I'm afraid it's worse than that, sweetheart. Your grandfather didn't just steal the letters. He made sure your mother received responses. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock. Maria looked confused while Richard felt a new wave of dread. What kind of responses? Maria asked quietly. Mrs. Patterson handed her a single letter written on Richard's old company letterhead. I intercepted this before it reached your mailbox. I recognized immediately that the handwriting wasn't Richard's. Maria read silently, her face growing paler with each word. When she finished, her hands were shaking. Read it aloud, Richard said, though he dreaded hearing the words. Maria, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I received your letter and need to be completely clear. Our relationship was a temporary arrangement that served its purpose. I have no interest in playing house or pretending to be a father to someone else's child. Please stop contacting me, as it's becoming an embarrassment to my professional reputation. I wish you well in finding someone more suited to the domestic life you clearly desire. Richard. The cruelty of the fake letter hit Richard like a physical blow. His father hadn't just prevented their communication, he'd actively worked to make Maria believe Richard was a heartless man who would reject his own child. Someone else's child, Richard repeated, his voice hollow. He made you think I believed Emma wasn't mine. There were 3 letters like that, Mrs. Patterson said sadly. Each one crueler than the last. The final one threatened legal action if Maria continued what the letter called false paternity claims and harassment. Maria was crying openly now, clutching the fake letter. I stopped writing after that last one, she whispered. I thought you hated me. I thought you believed I was trying to trap you with another man's baby. Richard knelt beside her chair, his own eyes filled with tears. Maria, you have to believe me. I never wrote those letters. I never thought any of those things. I loved you then and I. He stopped, suddenly aware of their audience. Emma, however, wasn't content to let the adults dance around their feelings. Tell her you still love her, Daddy, she said matter-of-factly. Mrs. Patterson says grown-ups sometimes forget to say important things because they're scared. Mrs. Patterson chuckled despite the heavy atmosphere. Out of the mouths of babes. Richard looked into Maria's tear-filled eyes and spoke the truth he'd carried for 7 years. I never stopped loving you, Maria. Every single day for 7 years, I've regretted walking away. I thought I was choosing success over love, but I was really choosing my father's approval over my own happiness. Richard, Maria whispered, but before she could continue, Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat meaningfully. Before you two get all romantic, the elderly woman said with a knowing smile, there's one more thing you need to know. About why Robert Sterling was so desperate to keep you apart. She moved to the final section of her evidence board, revealing newspaper clippings and what appeared to be financial documents. Your father wasn't just protecting your career, Richard, Mrs. Patterson said seriously. He was protecting a secret that could have changed everything about that Chicago deal. Richard and Maria exchanged confused glances. What kind of secret? Richard asked. Mrs. Patterson smiled mysteriously. Maria dear, what was your grandmother's maiden name? Henderson. Maria replied automatically. Why would that matter? The blood drained from Richard's face as the implication hit him. The Henderson Group, he said slowly. The company that offered to buy my business was owned by Maria's great-uncle Thomas. Mrs. Patterson finished triumphantly. When Robert Sterling realized his son was involved with the great-niece of his biggest potential business partner, he knew the family connection could either complicate the deal or make you too powerful within the Henderson organization. The revelation was staggering. The very deal that had torn them apart was connected to Maria's own family, and his father had known it all along. Your father was terrified that if you married into the Henderson family, you'd eventually inherit control of both companies, Mrs. Patterson continued. He wanted you successful, but not more successful than him. Richard felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. His father's deception had been even more calculated and cruel than he'd imagined. The implications of Mrs. Patterson's revelation continued to unfold as they sat in her living room, surrounded by 7 years' worth of evidence and lies. Emma had finished her candy and was now curled up in an oversized armchair, listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention that children give to stories that will reshape their understanding of the world. Mrs. Patterson, Maria said slowly, are you saying that my great-uncle Thomas knew about Richard and me? The elderly woman nodded gravely. Oh, he knew. In fact, he was delighted by the connection. Thomas Henderson was a romantic at heart, despite being one of the shrewdest businessmen on the East Coast. He believed that love and business could strengthen each other when built on trust and shared values. She pulled out another folder, this one containing formal-looking documents. This is a copy of a letter Thomas wrote to your father, Richard, just 2 weeks before you left for Chicago. He was planning to offer you a partnership position that would have made you one of the youngest executives in Henderson Group history. Richard took the letter with trembling hands. The letterhead was elegant, and Thomas Henderson's handwriting was bold and confident. Dear Robert, I'm writing to discuss an exciting opportunity for your son Richard. His relationship with my great-niece Maria has given me the chance to observe his character, and I'm impressed by both his business acumen and his integrity. I'd like to offer him a position that would allow him to build something meaningful while staying close to the people he loves. My father never showed me this, Richard said, his voice tight with emotion. Because he intercepted it, Mrs. Patterson replied. Just like he intercepted everything else that might have given you a choice different from the one he wanted you to make. Maria was studying another document in the folder. This is dated just 3 months ago, she said with confusion. It's addressed to me. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. That's from Thomas Henderson's estate lawyer. Your great-uncle passed away 6 months ago, and he left specific instructions about how to find you. It seems he never stopped hoping that you and Richard would find your way back to each other. Emma perked up from her chair. What does it say, Mommy? Maria read the formal language slowly, her eyes widening with each paragraph. It says that Uncle Thomas left me a trust fund for Emma's education and, oh my goodness, a 25% stake in Henderson Group. The room fell silent as the magnitude of this revelation sank in. Maria, who had been working multiple jobs just to make ends meet, was suddenly part owner of one of the most successful companies in the country. There's more, Mrs. Patterson said gently. The trust document includes a provision that if you ever married Richard Sterling, your combined business interests would make you equal partners with the other major shareholders. Thomas believed that your love story was meant to unite 2 business legacies. Richard felt overwhelmed by the cosmic irony of it all. His father's manipulation had not only cost him 7 years with Maria and Emma, but had also prevented a business partnership that would have fulfilled all of Robert Sterling's ambitions while allowing Richard to build a life based on love rather than lonely success. Uncle Thomas tried to find me for years. Maria continued reading. He hired private investigators, but they kept running into dead ends. Now I know why. Your father was actively working to keep me hidden. Emma, who had been unusually quiet during this part of the conversation, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that children sometimes possess when adults are too emotional to see clearly. So Grandpa Robert was afraid that if Daddy married Mommy, they would be too happy and too successful, and that would make him feel small? She asked. Mrs. Patterson smiled at Emma's simple but accurate assessment. That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make terrible choices because they're afraid of being left behind. Richard stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where his life had taken such a dramatically different turn 7 years ago. The weight of his father's betrayal was crushing, but underneath the pain was a growing sense of possibility. Maria, he said without turning around, I know I have no right to ask this after everything that's happened, but I need you to know something. Even if you hadn't inherited anything from your great-uncle, even if there were no business connections or financial opportunities, I would still be standing here tonight asking for a second chance. He turned to face her, his heart laid bare. I don't want to rebuild our relationship because it makes business sense or because it's what Thomas Henderson hoped for. I want to rebuild it because Emma deserves to have both her parents, and because I've spent 7 years learning that success without love is just an expensive way to be miserable. Maria was crying again, but these tears seemed different, less bitter, more hopeful. The question is, Richard continued, can you forgive me for being weak enough to let my father manipulate us? Can you trust me to make better choices this time? Before Maria could answer, Emma jumped down from her chair and walked over to stand between her parents. I think, she said with the solemn authority of a 7-year-old who had been thinking very hard, that Grandpa Robert was wrong about love making people weak. Mrs. Patterson, and I think love makes people stronger and smarter and braver. She looked up at Richard with eyes that held no trace of doubt. And I think you've been sad long enough, Daddy. Mommy's been sad too. Maybe it's time to try being happy together. In that moment, standing in Mrs. Patterson's apartment surrounded by evidence of his father's deception and his great-uncle Thomas's hopes, Richard realized that his 7-year-old daughter was the wisest person in the room. 3 days later, Richard found himself sitting in his corner office, staring at 2 documents that would determine the course of his entire future. The first was a merger proposal from Henderson Group's board of directors, offering to combine Sterling Industries with their own company in a partnership that would create one of the most powerful business entities on the East Coast. The second was a resignation letter he had written but not yet signed, a letter that would allow him to walk away from everything he had built to focus on rebuilding his family. His assistant Sarah knocked and entered with her usual efficiency. Mr. Sterling, the Henderson Group representatives are here for the 3 p.m. meeting. Shall I show them in? In a moment, Richard replied, still staring at the unsigned resignation letter. Sarah, can I ask you something personal? She looked surprised. In 5 years of working together, Richard had never asked her opinion on anything that wasn't strictly business-related. Of course, sir. Do you think it's possible for someone to change completely? To become a different person than they were before? Sarah studied his face with the same analytical attention she brought to contract negotiations. Are we talking about you, Mr. Sterling? Richard nodded, feeling vulnerable in a way that would have been impossible just a week ago. I think, Sarah said carefully, that you've been a different person ever since you came back from that dinner with your daughter. You smile more. You actually said please and thank you to the cleaning staff yesterday. And you've been working normal hours instead of sleeping in your office. She paused, then continued with growing confidence. I think the person you were before, the driven, ruthless businessman, was never really you. I think that was your father's version of who you should be. The man I've been working for this week, the one who asks about my family and remembers that I have a life outside this office, feels more authentic. Richard was touched by her honesty. What would you do if you were in my position? You mean choosing between building a business empire and building a family? Sarah smiled. Mr. Sterling, you're the smartest man I know when it comes to identifying valuable opportunities. What's more valuable, money you can't take with you when you die, or people who will love you whether you're rich or poor? Before Richard could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Emma's school play is tomorrow night at 7 p.m. She really wants you to be there. No pressure, but she's been practicing her lines in the mirror and telling everyone that her daddy is coming to watch her perform. The message was followed by a photo of Emma in a costume that appeared to be a cross between a princess and a scientist, complete with a small telescope and a glittery crown. She was grinning at the camera with the kind of pure joy that Richard had forgotten existed in the world. The choice suddenly became crystal clear. Richard picked up his pen and signed the resignation letter, then immediately picked up his phone to call Maria. "Hello?" Her voice sounded cautious, as if she were afraid of hoping for too much. "Maria, it's me. I'm coming to Emma's play tomorrow night, and I need to tell you something important. I'm resigning from Sterling Industries." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Richard wondered if the call had been dropped. "Richard, you can't do that," Maria finally said. "Sterling Industries is your life's work. I won't be responsible for you throwing away everything you've built." "You're not responsible," Richard said firmly. "I'm making this choice because I finally understand what my life's work should really be. Building a company means nothing if I don't have a family to share it with. But the Henderson Group merger will happen with or without me," Richard interrupted. "Sarah's been running most of the day-to-day operations for years anyway. She'll make a better CEO than I ever was because she actually cares about the people who work here, not just the profit margins." He could hear Maria crying softly on the other end of the phone. "Maria, 7 years ago I chose my career over love because I thought success would make me happy. It didn't. I've been successful and miserable for 7 years, and I'm tired of pretending that money can fill the hole in my heart where you and Emma should be." "What are you saying?" Maria whispered. Richard took a deep breath and spoke the words that would either save his life or destroy what little security he had left. "I'm saying that I want to start over. Not as Richard Sterling, CEO of a major corporation, but as Richard Sterling, Emma's father and the man who loves you more than anything else in the world. I want to come to school plays and help with homework and teach Emma how to ride a bike. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding your hand every night." The silence stretched again, but this time Richard could hear the difference. It wasn't the silence of doubt, it was the silence of someone whose dreams were suddenly becoming possible. "The Henderson Group wants to meet with me tomorrow," Maria said quietly. "About my inheritance and my new role in the company. I'm terrified, Richard. I don't know anything about running a business." "Then we'll learn together," Richard said without hesitation. "Emma deserves to see her parents working as a team, building something meaningful together. And maybe that's what your great-uncle Thomas was hoping for all along." There was another pause, and then Maria's voice came through the phone clearer and stronger than before. "Emma's play starts at 7 tomorrow night. But maybe you could come for dinner first? Around 5? I'm making spaghetti and meatballs, and Emma wants to show you her science project." Richard felt a smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile he'd had in 7 years. "I'll be there at 5, he said. "And Maria? I love you. I never stopped loving you, and I never will." "I love you too," she whispered. "Welcome home, Richard." As he hung up the phone and looked around his corner office for what might be the last time, Richard realized that he was about to trade his view of the Manhattan skyline for something infinitely more valuable, a view of his daughter's smile across a dinner table and his wife's face on the pillow next to his. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Sterling was about to discover what it felt like to be truly successful. The elementary school auditorium was filled with the beautiful chaos that only a children's theatrical production could create. Parents adjusted cameras and phone settings while siblings squirmed in their seats, and somewhere behind the makeshift curtain, 23 second graders were probably having various degrees of stage fright and costume malfunctions. Richard sat in the third row, flanked by Maria and Mrs. Patterson, who had insisted on coming to support her Emma. In his hands, he held a bouquet of daisies, Emma's favorite flowers, according to Maria, and in his heart he carried a nervousness that rivaled any board meeting or hostile takeover he had ever experienced. "She's been practicing her lines for weeks," Maria whispered, squeezing his hand. "She plays Dr. Emma Rodriguez, a scientist who discovers that love is the most powerful force in the universe." Richard squeezed back, marveling at how perfectly their fingers fit together, as if no time had passed at all. Did she choose that character herself? She wrote it herself. Maria replied with pride. When the teacher said they could create their own characters for the space exploration play, Emma decided she wanted to be a scientist who proves that families can overcome any obstacle if they work together. Mrs. Patterson leaned over with a knowing smile. That child has been directing her own love story since she could talk. You two are just finally catching up to her script. The lights dimmed, and Richard felt his heart rate accelerate. Somewhere behind that curtain was his daughter, about to perform in her first school play, and he was here to watch her. After 7 years of missing every important milestone, he was finally going to be the father in the audience cheering for his little girl. The curtain opened to reveal a cardboard spaceship and a backdrop painted with stars and planets. One by one, the young astronauts took the stage, each explaining their mission to explore different aspects of the universe. There were experts in gravity, specialists in planets, and researchers studying alien life forms. Then Emma appeared, and Richard's breath caught in his throat. She wore a lab coat decorated with glittery stars, safety goggles pushed up on her forehead, and a name tag that read, Dr. Emma Rodriguez, Love Scientist. In her hands, she carried a small telescope and what appeared to be a clipboard full of important research notes. Greetings, fellow space explorers. Emma announced in a clear, confident voice that carried to the back of the auditorium. I am Dr. Emma Rodriguez, and I have made the most important discovery in the history of the universe. The other young astronauts gathered around her, playing their parts with the earnest dedication that only children could bring to a performance. What did you discover, Dr. Rodriguez? Asked a boy dressed as an alien with green face paint and antennae. Emma looked directly at the audience, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found Richard. When their gazes met, her face lit up with a smile so radiant that Richard felt tears begin to blur his vision. I discovered that love is not just an emotion, Emma declared, never breaking eye contact with her father. Love is a force that can bring families together across any distance, even when they've been separated by misunderstandings and mistakes. She gestured toward her telescope. I observed many families throughout the galaxy, and I learned that sometimes mommies and daddies get lost from each other. But if they love each other and their children enough, the gravitational pull of that love will always bring them back together. Richard was openly crying now, not caring who saw him. Maria's hand tightened in his as she too was moved by their daughter's performance. But Dr. Rodriguez, asked a girl dressed as an astronaut, what if the family has been apart for a very long time? What if they forgot how to be together? Emma's expression grew serious, and Richard could see that she was no longer just reciting memorized lines. She was speaking from her heart, sharing the wisdom that only a child who had longed for a complete family could possess. Love has a very good memory, Emma said solemnly. Even when people forget how to be together, love remembers. And love is very patient. It waits for the right moment to remind everyone what really matters. She walked to the front of the stage, addressing the audience directly. In my research, I discovered that the strongest families are not the ones who never face problems. The strongest families are the ones who choose to work together to solve their problems, even when it's hard. The other children on stage began to gather around Emma, creating a tableau that represented unity and cooperation. My scientific conclusion, Emma announced with the gravity of a real researcher presenting groundbreaking findings, is that love combined with forgiveness and second chances creates the most powerful force in the universe. It's stronger than rocket fuel, brighter than any star, and more valuable than all the treasures on all the planets we could ever explore. The audience erupted in applause, but Richard was barely aware of the sound. All he could see was his daughter, standing confidently on that stage, having just delivered a performance that was really a love letter to her parents and a blueprint for their future as a family. As the curtain fell and the children took their bows, Emma blew a kiss directly to Richard and mouthed the words, I love you, Daddy. In that moment, Richard Sterling realized that his daughter had just taught him the most important lesson of his life. Success wasn't measured in dollars or deals or corporate achievements. Success was measured in moments like this, moments when love triumphed over fear, when families chose each other over everything else, and when a 7-year-old girl could heal 7 years of heartbreak with her wisdom and hope. After the show, as Emma ran into his arms still wearing her lab coat and glittery goggles, Richard knew that he had finally found his way home. Not to a building or a company or a bank account, but to the place where he belonged, in the embrace of the two people who loved him not for what he had accomplished, but simply for who he was. "Did you like my play, Daddy?" Emma asked, her face flushed with excitement and pride. "It was the most important performance I've ever seen," Richard said honestly, lifting her up and spinning her around while Maria laughed and Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Good," Emma said with satisfaction as he set her back down. "Because now we can start the real performance, being a family together." As they walked out of the school auditorium together, hand in hand, Richard realized that his daughter was right. The real performance was just beginning, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't wait to see how the story would end. 6 months later, Richard stood in the backyard of their new home, watching Emma teach their golden retriever puppy Einstein how to fetch. The dog seemed more interested in chasing butterflies, but Emma's patience was infinite. "Daddy, watch this," Emma called out, holding up a tennis ball. "Einstein is going to be the smartest dog in the neighborhood." Einstein promptly ran the opposite direction, and Emma dissolved into giggles that filled the air like music. Richard marveled at how natural joy felt when shared with the people you loved most. The past 6 months had transformed every aspect of his life. Richard had resigned from Sterling Industries, which Sarah now ran with remarkable success. The Henderson Group merger had proceeded smoothly, creating a company culture that valued both profit and people. Maria had embraced her role as a major stakeholder with fierce determination, bringing perspectives Richard had never considered. Her insights had led to employee benefit improvements that were being praised throughout the industry. "Richard?" Maria's voice called from the house. "Can you come inside? There's something I need to show you." He found her in their home office, standing beside a large easel covered with a sheet. Her expression was mysterious, mischievous in a way that reminded him of the woman he'd fallen in love with years ago. "Emma and I have been working on a project," Maria said, slipping into his arms. "We wanted to create something special to celebrate how far we've all come." She pulled away the sheet, revealing a poster board covered with photographs, documents, and artwork. At the top, in Emma's careful handwriting, were the words, "Daddy's Real Success Story." Richard's breath caught as he studied the display. Photos from the past 6 months showed him pushing Emma on swings, building snowmen, family game nights. But interspersed were older images, pictures of Richard and Maria from their early relationship, copies of Maria's unsent letters, even Mrs. Patterson's surveillance photos. Emma wanted to create evidence of love, Maria explained softly. She said Mrs. Patterson taught her that important stories need proof. In the center was Emma's latest drawing, no longer simple stick figures, but a sophisticated artwork showing their family in front of their house with Einstein playing in the yard. Above them, stars with the words, "Love is the strongest force in the universe. Dr. Emma Rodriguez, love scientist." "There's more," Maria said, pointing to a section Richard hadn't noticed. "Emma found these in your father's papers when we cleaned out his office." Richard's heart nearly stopped. There, preserved in plastic sleeves, were copies of all Maria's intercepted letters, and copies of letters Richard had written to Maria but never sent, letters his father had somehow discovered and kept. "He kept them," Richard whispered, studying his own handwriting from 7 years ago. The letter in his hands was one he remembered writing during his 3rd month in Chicago. "My dearest Maria, I made the biggest mistake of my life when I walked away from you. Every morning I wake up hoping this will be the day I find the courage to come home. I love you more than any success could ever satisfy. Mrs. Patterson thinks your father kept them because deep down, he knew he was wrong," Maria said gently. "Maybe in his final years he regretted the choice he made for you." Emma's voice interrupted from the doorway. "Mommy, is it time for the surprise yet?" Richard turned to see his daughter holding an official-looking document, practically bouncing with excitement. "What surprise?" Richard asked. Emma bounced over, holding out the document. "It's from Great Uncle Thomas. Mrs. Patterson said we should wait for the right moment, and Mommy said today was perfect because it's exactly 6 months since we became a real family again." Richard took the document with trembling hands. It was a letter in Thomas Henderson's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. "My dear Richard," he read aloud, "if you are reading this, it means love has finally triumphed over the obstacles Robert placed in your path. I have been waiting 7 years for this moment, confident it would come, because love like yours and Maria's doesn't simply disappear, it waits for the right opportunity to flourish again." The letter explained that Thomas had left specific instructions: a trust fund for Emma's education, a foundation in Richard and Maria's names to help families torn apart by corporate pressures, and most surprisingly, a request that Richard consider taking over as CEO of the combined Henderson-Sterling organization. He believed, Richard continued reading, that a man who chose love over ambition, who walked away from power to read bedtime stories to his daughter, would be exactly the kind of leader the business world needs. Someone who understands that true success is measured not in profits alone, but in the positive impact we have on people's lives. The letter concluded, "Welcome home, my boy. Take care of our girls, and help them build a world where love and success can coexist. Your father believed strength came from isolation, but real strength comes from the courage to be vulnerable with the people who matter most." As Richard finished reading, Emma and Maria watched him with expressions of hope and anticipation. "So?" Emma asked, unable to contain herself. "Will you do it? Will you be the boss so you can make sure all the mommies and daddies get to come home for dinner with their kids?" Richard looked around their home office, walls covered with Emma's artwork, family photos, and vision boards showing their future dreams. This was success, not the cold perfection of his old corner office, but the warm chaos of a life built on love and shared purpose. "Yes," he said, pulling both Maria and Emma into his arms. "But only if I get to bring my family to work sometimes, so everyone can see what real success looks like." Emma cheered and threw her arms around his neck. "Wait until I tell Mrs. Patterson. She's going to be so excited that her love story finally got its happy ending." As they stood there surrounded by evidence of their journey from heartbreak to healing, Richard finally understood what his father had never grasped. True success wasn't about building an empire that would outlast you. It was about building relationships that would fill your life with meaning while you lived it. Outside, Einstein barked happily as he finally caught the tennis ball, and somewhere in the neighborhood, Mrs. Patterson was probably taking photographs, documenting another chapter in what she would call the greatest love story ever told. Richard had spent 7 years climbing the corporate ladder, only to discover he'd been climbing in the wrong direction. Real success wasn't about reaching the top, it was about finding your way home to people who would love you whether you succeeded or failed, whether you were rich or poor, whether you were a CEO or simply the man who kissed them goodnight. And as Emma's laughter filled their house and Maria's hand found his, Richard Sterling realized he had finally achieved the only success that truly mattered. He had learned how to love and be loved in return. The greatest empire he would ever build was right here, in this house, with these two extraordinary women who had taught him that the most valuable treasures in life could never be bought or sold. They could only be cherished, protected, and shared. This was his real success story, and it was just beginning.